The United States is the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of weapons. The U.S. government claims to be judicious about how it wages war and supports allies with armaments. But is that really the case? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. The power of the U.S. military-industrial complex is a largely unquestioned fact in Washington and globally, but are criticisms of the defense industry gaining traction? Here in Washington, the Pentagon's Inspector General is investigating whether acting Defense Secretary and former Boeing executive Patrick Shanahan used his post to promote his former employer, Boeing. There is renewed talk of bringing the war in Afghanistan to an end, and Congress is now pushing to stop U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in their bombing campaign in Yemen. We'll be discussing all this with Leon Panetta, former director of the CIA and former defense secretary under President Obama. But first, let's take a quick look at how America's arms industry has evolved.
Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered.
Great job.
Does the U.S. government truly exercise restraint in arms sales and transfers to other countries, or do profit and politics come before human rights concerns? We're now joined by former Secretary of Defense and former CIA Director Leon Panetta. Secretary Panetta, thanks very much for being with us. When you look at the disastrous humanitarian situation in Yemen and the way U.S.-made weapons are being used to kill and maim civilians, many of them children, what goes through your mind?
Well, I think all of us have to be concerned about the number of innocent lives that are being lost in Yemen. And a lot of that is due to, unfortunately, not having good intelligence on the ground, particularly with regards to targeting. If you're going to use these kinds of sophisticated weapons, you've got to have good intelligence that is able to identify specific targets and make sure that you don't have a lot of collateral damage from these weapons. So my concern is that although these weapons were provided, that unfortunately the countries using those weapons have not developed the kind of sophisticated intelligence and capabilities to be able to use them wisely.
But is it, Secretary Panetta, about intelligence capabilities? We're talking about, as you say, very sophisticated weapons, F-15 bomber jets and other weapons sold to the Saudis, sold to the UAE under the Obama administration. In fact, when you were CIA director and later on when you were defense secretary, they are being used by these countries and their allies in their indiscriminate bombing campaign in Yemen. Do you have any regrets beyond the concerns?
Well, again, I think part of the problem is that the United States has not exercised the kind of influence that it should with regards to the use of these kinds of weapons and try to assist these countries to be able to use them in an effective way.
But beyond that, I mean, when you look at the role, the active support that the Obama administration gave the Saudis and the Emiratis from the beginning. I know you were no longer in office because the aerial bombing of Yemen started in April of 2015, but there was tacit, if covert, active, material US support from the Obama administration. Why did Obama allow the Saudis and their allies to launch this bombing campaign in the first place? Do you think it was gross miscalculation? Was it a foreign policy blunder? Or was it something far worse?
Well, you know, I think you have to look at the history here of what was involved in the United States involvement in Yemen. It began because of the concern about terrorism in Yemen. And that was shared by the government in Yemen. They were concerned about terrorists who were able to not only attack their own people, but were planning attacks on the United States and Europe.
But you must have suspected that the Saudis and their allies would use these weapons with impunity, with very little oversight. There was already mounting evidence and criticism by credible human rights organizations, Amnesty and others. There was mounting criticism on the Hill. More than 50 members of Congress, in fact, signed a letter asking President Obama to confront the Saudis. None of that happened. Quite the opposite, in fact. President Obama continued to shower weapons and military aid on the Saudis, $1 billion worth of smart bombs, and that's on top of the earlier $60 billion weapons deal. Can we pretend that President Obama and his administration did not coddle the Saudis?
Well, you know, I don't think there's any question when weapons are provided, whether it's to Turkey or whether it's to other countries in that region, those countries are sovereign countries and make the decision as to how they're going to use those weapons. It doesn't mean that we ought to excuse the use of those weapons in a careless or negligent fashion. But I don't think you can blame the United States for what the Saudi Arabians decided they were going to do in using those weapons.
But would you say, Secretary Panetta, that the US is legally and morally responsible, that it is an enabler, an accomplice in the alleged war crimes, given the fact that this war, which is now in its 4th year, could not possibly have started, even continued, without the US's tacit support?
Look, I think that, that of course there are moral issues involved here, and that the international community in general should be concerned about how these weapons are being used and the number of innocent deaths that are occurring in Yemen. It is cause for concern. And what that means is, frankly, it is the responsibility of the international community to bring pressure on Saudi Arabia and others that are involved there to make sure that those kinds of deaths do not occur. At the same time, I think it's also important that pressure has to be brought on Iran and the Houthis, who continue their aggressive actions as well. You know, this is a war going on in Yemen.
I want to ask you a couple of questions, Secretary Panetta, about your time as CIA director and the fact that drone attacks in many countries, including Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, significantly increased under your watch.
Well, look, I felt my responsibility as CIA director and as Secretary of Defense was to protect the people of the United States. That was my goal. We had suffered a vicious attack on 9/11 that killed 3,000 innocent people here in the United States. we did not want to allow terrorists to conduct a similar attack again.
But is that really what happened? I mean, is there any evidence to suggest that these attacks, these drone attacks, ever made Americans safer? When you look back at this, do you believe that killing innocent people, including children, is an acceptable act of war?
Look, if there are individuals who are terrorists who are planning attacks in our country, we have a responsibility to protect our people. And that means going after those targets. And look, you know, when you've been attacked as we were in 9/11, you know, we could have used F-16 planes. We could have used B-2 bombers to go after our enemy, but we didn't. We used precise targeting to go after individuals and their targets. Was there collateral damage in some cases? Of course. But in war, that is the case.
Putting aside the many ethical and moral issues that are brought up, and you yourself, I know, admitted to the fact that you were once involved in ordering a drone strike when you knew that there was at least one woman and several children who were going to eventually either be maimed or die in the attack, yet you did it. By definition, though, Secretary Panetta, these extrajudicial killings, would you agree, are very serious crimes, aren't they? That's the position you probably would take if these drone attacks were carried out by any country, including Iran, of course. Yes or no?
No. You know, I'd like to hear you give me an excuse for what Al-Qaeda did in attacking our country and killing 3,000 people. You tell me if that was justified. And if your answer is that it was not justified, then it remained for the United States of America to continue to go after those terrorists to make sure that other innocent Americans would not be killed. That was the point. And frankly, we were successful in that effort because we have not suffered another 9/11 attack in the United States.
But what did Yemen have to do with 9/11?
You're the one who's asking me about the CIA's efforts in going after terrorists. You know, that has nothing to do with Yemen, except that terrorists did appear in Yemen, and we had a responsibility to go after those terrorists as well.
I was asking you about the fact that there were lots of drone attacks that were carried out in Yemen. Was there any specific link to 9/11 when you carried out these drone attacks?
Yeah, we were trying to prevent terrorists from attacking the United States.
Secretary Leon Panetta, thank you very, very much indeed. Last week, the US Congress voted to end American support for the Saudi and UAE-led bombing campaign in Yemen, a campaign that has claimed thousands of civilian lives and led to widespread starvation. We spoke with Yemeni victims of US-made bombs and met some of the Americans who have consistently criticized the role of the US weapons industry in Yemen and other wars.
أبو سميح علي شوقي الشهيد، محمد الشهيد، بغوي الشهيد، علي جربوش الشهيد. يعني متجابرين لما وصلنا لنا الحاج أجزانا نقول إحنا حرمون. خلاص تآمنا وتآمن لنا الدنيا ما قد معنا حد مش يصرف قد علينا مش يشكاد علينا مش يروح وياتي. يوم الاثنين صباح من تواسين يروحوا من ما بروحوا ونموت. الحمد لله اللهم لك الحمد صفون الطيران اللهم لك الحمد والشكر. فكان يضر الله من ضرنا شيء يحرم الله عافيته من حرمنا بنينا من يتم أولادنا هيكتم الله يكتم أولاده إن شاء الله بحكم الحق من سلامتك.
There's not a lot that we can do to change the policy of our country on a day-to-day basis, but we can be conscious of what we're doing at least. We've been out here in various configurations for about 20 years every month. This is what our community is invested in, much to our shame. That Raytheon Missile Systems is the largest exporter in southern Arizona, dollar-wise. We export more from here, but what we're exporting is death. Our purpose in being here is to remind the workers that indeed that is their job, producing weapons that are not necessarily for our defense. Some of them greet us, you know, with a wave and a honk, and others with a curse and a rude gesture, but that's okay. We're out here because this is what we can do.
Now, since we spoke with Samih and his family, the bombing of Yemen hasn't stopped, nor has U.S. support for the Saudi and UAE-led military campaign. But Congress is moving to stop American support for it. Senator Bernie Sanders is suggesting a similar resolution could be passed regarding the war in Afghanistan. So does this herald a change in U.S. policy for weapons transfers and military involvement? We're joined by Dakota Wood, a former U.S. Marine and Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs at the Heritage Foundation, and Gregory Foster, a former Army officer and Professor of National Security Studies at the National Defense University. Dakota Wood, you believe, and I quote, that a strong, confident, and engaged America is good for the world. Why is that so?
Well, I mean, we trade a lot with the world, right? We have things to offer, and we like to buy and sell things from various markets and partners all over the world. And you also have a foreign policy component to that, where America, for many, many years, many decades, has been really a leading light in, you know, freedom and democracy, representative government, all those sorts of things. So
well, you mentioned freedom and democracy.
Yes, yes.
And you also say that, quote, the free world needs a force for good to stand against repressive regimes. But isn't the U.S. backing repressive regimes?
Well, I think we're mixing some things here, okay? So the first part is the role of America in the world. And for decades, we've had a history of doing very good things with many partners to roll back repressive regimes, right? So that's an enduring quality of American involvement. You will have specific instances, even in World War II, where Great Britain and the United States allied with Stalin's Russia, right, the Soviet Union, to roll back the evil of Nazism led by Adolf Hitler. So you have
I'm not talking about World War II, I'm talking about recent history. I'm talking about the present day. Countries involved in the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, not to mention President Trump's newfound love affair with the North Korean leader. I mean, these are not exactly the least
really
repressive regimes, are they?
What he's saying is that he understands that certain leaders in certain countries can get things done because of the nature of their autocratic regimes, which we are adamantly against in this country. But when you have larger strategic interests, like how do we get rid of North Korea's nuclear stockpile, right? How do we get rid of other evils and repressive regimes in other countries? Sometimes you have to have discussions. And if the president wasn't engaged in discussion with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, then he would be criticized for not engaging and be too isolationist. But when you do have those discussions, then he's criticized for coddling up to dictators.
Gregory Foster, do you see it that way?
I don't see it that way. The only thing I think we share in common is the acknowledgement that it's important that the United States be actively engaged in the world. That doesn't mean militarily engaged. It doesn't mean executing an interventionist foreign policy, which I think we are doing. I think the question of the example we set and the extent to which our words coincide with our behavior are extremely important in setting a truly an ethical and by association a strategic example for the rest of the world.
So where does it leave the United States in terms of becoming a stronger or weaker nation and superpower, its relationship with the defense industry?
Strong is something that is not necessarily, in fact, I would argue, not at all measured in purely military terms. Strength is a perceptual construct that has much to do with our behavior, our employment of various instruments of power at our disposal. I fear we're in deep danger of setting ourselves up as an overly militaristic force that will not elicit what we want.
Weapons obviously consume as well a huge amount of the federal budget. How much does a single destroyer take away from other crucial spending?
we're talking about over $1 billion. And if we look at destroyers that are on the books or planned, we're talking about maybe $4.5 billion per item, and that's out of bounds, I would say.
Which could be better spent
Could
where?
be better spent on other, not only equally, but maybe even more strategically important national programs.
Dakota Wood, I presume
Well,
you don't
I
you
just
don't
think
agree.
the whole conversation is quite convoluted here. We need to be clear about what we're actually discussing.
Sure,
in this,
but you
issue.
talk about the need to keep the American military strong, but aren't
Yes.
you in the process allowing the defense industry to drive U.S. foreign
Oh,
policy?
no, absolutely not. No, that's ridiculous. I mean, for very good reasons, to get greatest return on a taxpayer dollar, we have sought efficiencies over the last 20 or 30 years. So if I can neck down the number of different types of airplanes to a single model, I get great efficiencies and great return on the dollar. What I do, though, is I introduce strategic vulnerabilities, and then I only have one company that can produce a particular type of plane. We only have one tank manufacturing plant in Lima, Ohio. We only have one company that can produce, like, say, an aircraft carrier. So in the interest of getting better return on the dollar, we're failing to account for the complexity of warfare and actually the necessity of having redundancy and capabilities so that you don't actually have a brittle force.
If I could register a semantic contradiction here, I think what we need is not a strong military per se, but an effective military. We don't win wars anymore. We persist in perpetuating the preferred American way of war, which quite frankly, quite bluntly, is killing people and breaking things as lethally and destructively as possible. And that works against our best interests.
Well, again, I think you're completely misguided on this, okay? That a policy decision is different than the capability of the military force employed. So I can have a tank and a trained tank crew. How I decide to use that is a policy issue. The types of wars that we've been fighting have been against opponents that don't have air forces, navies, armor, artillery, anything like that. Irregular opponents in very complicated social structures where we don't go into military defeat an opponent. And so
hold on,
we have
though.
actually held fire in many ways in doing that.
But isn't U.S. policy being predicated constantly on the need and the search for constant enemies? Because if you take a
No,
look at the
absolutely
most
not.
recent
You don't go out and look
national
for
defense
enemies.
strategy,
No,
it seems to be a
competitors
call. It
rise
seems
up.
to be a call for a new Cold War.
No, not exactly. You know, when the Soviet Union goes away, it was a happy decade of the 1990s. There were no major competitors because Russia now was on its hind feet and was trying to find its way economically and politically. China had not yet risen as a global power. North Korea didn't have a nuclear inventory, and Iran wasn't as aggressive in the Middle East. Over the last 30 years, conditions have changed. A much more expansive and aggressive type of Russia, a much more expansive and economically powerful China. So it's not that we go out looking for enemies. We have major competitors rise, and we have to be on par to be able to contest some of these contested domains.
Professor Foster, who in this new strategy is the main rival, not to say threat? Is it China? Is it Russia?
Well, the new strategy is basically what is contained in the 2018 National Defense Strategy document. I think the National Security Strategy document issued before that by the White House was irrelevant from the start and is in essence moribund now, and what has taken its place is the National Defense Strategy document, which argues that the world we face now is basically a great power competition in which revisionist powers, specifically China and Russia, are trying to unseat us from our pedestal. And that document also argues for lethality as a principal line of effort. All of that, plus other provisions of that strategy document, basically give an open door and a blank check to the so-called military-industrial complex.
No, I think it's nonsense. We have a military for a specific purpose. It is not the Department of State, and you want your military to be militarily relevant
But it
and
sounds like,
militarily
but it
competent.
does sound like U.S. imperialism is still thriving, very much alive and well, isn't it?
That's silly.
I
Absolutely silly.
would actually predicate my position on all of this on an unusual place, and that is on civil-military relations, which is the tacit but binding social contract of mutual rights and obligations and expectations that ties the military to its civilian overseers, and both of them to society in turn. And I think if we had an ideal state of civil-military relations, we would have one that has what I would characterize as a properly subordinated military-industrial complex, which we do not have.
I completely disagree.
The earlier comment was predicated on the notion that political direction establishes what the military has to do, and the military only executes that. I think we're in a position now where the military is totally dominant and has policymakers by the throat, if you will.
Gregory Foster and Dakota Wood, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
President Trump is expected to veto Congress's measure on Yemen, but it still marks the first time the War Powers Act has been invoked by both the House and the Senate since it passed in 1973. Could the ability of U.S. presidents to wage war without congressional support and in violation of that resolution finally be coming to an end? From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.